We are live.
Okay, hello everybody. Let's quieten down. So, just let you take your seats on the floor. Welcome to this panel on Marxism, literature and political commitment. I'm sorry about the smell in here, but I think like ideology, in some conceptions, you get used to it after a while, and then eventually you don't even notice it. So look forward to that. My name is Esther Leslie. I'm a member of the HM editorial board, and I am your chair for this evening. I won't make too long an introduction, as we want to get to the presentations, and each speaker will talk for around 20-25 minutes, one after another. And then there'll be time for questions, perhaps some from me and certainly from the floor. But I will give a small sketch of each speaker, which is not easy as they have so much to their names, but I'm sure all, or at least most of them, are known already to many of you. So we'll take them in the order in the programme. So we'll begin with Terry Eagleton, who is a eminence grise, as they say, of literary studies, formerly lecturer or professor at Oxford and Manchester. I've been visiting University Open Days lately, and I was struck in the library at the University of Bristol by an array of at least 15 copies of Literary Theory and Introduction and a couple of the updated edition. So still a reference text. I can see why it sold more than 750,000 copies since 1983. But it's just a tiny part of Terry Eagleton's output. He's forged a name as a Marxist critic and a critic of Marxist criticism. He's written about form and genre and concepts such as humour, materialism, tragedy, sacrifice, religion. He's written about specific theorists. Probably the first book that really impacted my thinking was his book on Walter Benjamin, Towards a Revolutionary Criticism, all those years ago. But he is also here as a creative writer who wrote Saints and Scholars, a novel, The Gatekeeper, a memoir, play and screenplay work on Wittgenstein, and a play on Oscar Wilde, St. Oscar. I can't remember who's next. Is it Lea or Angela in the programme? Someone tell me. No one knows. Okay. I'll introduce Lea Ypi, Professor of Political Theory at the LSE and known in that field through books including Global Justice and Avant-Garde Political Agency from 2012, The Architectonic of Reason, Purposiveness and Systematic Unity in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. But the reason why we invited Lea onto this panel was because of her not so much novelistic or fictional contribution, but an extraordinarily inventive, imaginative, wonderful autobiography that has been multiply lauded and awarded, called Free, Coming of Age at the End of History from 2021, which was about her growing up in Albania, across and through the 80s and after, and it was about family history and politics and much more, and extraordinarily comic in sort of the deeper sense. And this year, very recently out, a second family-oriented book called Indignity, A Life Reimagined, which is about political intrigues and family secrets, all sort of beautifully entertaining while also being so sharply political and revelatory. And our third speaker is Angela Dimitrakaki, who's another scholar with multiple facets. She's a long-standing associate of Historical Materialism Journal and in earlier days was on the editorial board. I think you're now on that the loftier board of consulting editors, or whatever they're called. She's Professor of Contemporary Art History and Theory at the University of Edinburgh, and has another panel here on Sunday where she's launching her latest book, Feminism, Art, and Capitalism, which joins in her bibliography along with gender artwork and the global imperative from 2013, art and globalization from the postmodern sign to the biopolitical arena from 2013, which is only in Greek, and more. And she's written a lot about themes including curating in and relation to labor, production and social reproduction, art institutions, imperialism, colonialism, art and culture, and anti-fascism. And we worked together on a wonderful, issue of third text that she put together around anti-fascism and art. But more directly, why Angela is here is because she's also an essayist, an award-winning fiction writer, writing in her native Greek. So much acclaimed, but woefully little is translated into English in this capacity, it's translated into other languages. So her first novel was in 1997, Antarctica, set in Athens in the 1990s and in relation to youth in that period. That was followed by a collection of short stories with the great title Nosebleed, another novel, Anti-Sea, in the magical realist genre, third novel, The Manifesto of Defeat in 2006, which is very much related to an ascendant fascism in 21st century Europe and is well lauded, as I understand, as a very important novel in Greek. Other novels, I mean, just so many. Inside a Girl Like You from 2009, shortlisted for prizes. Tina, The Story of an Alignment in 2019. Work on conflict and breakthrough and issues within European politics and emotional relations. And I think there's 4 testimonies about the exhumation of the river Erinos, which was written in 2004, but revised in 2016, which was awarded a prize. So all 3 of them have great reason to talk to us about Marxism, literature and political commitment. So I'll invite Terry up.
Can you hear that? Okay, yes, it's all right. Yeah. Marcel Proust's mother, which is always an excellent way to begin a talk, and I begin most of my talks with the phrase Marcel Proust's mother, whatever I'm talking about, was pregnant with him during the Paris Commune. And being a good Parisian bourgeoise, she was horrified, of course, by what was going on. And there were resultant complications in her pregnancy, which some reckon might have contributed to Proust's famous asthma. There are also critics who think that Proust's wonderfully complex, sinuous syntax, as one subclause, hooks on to another, perhaps to the length of a whole page, is a sort of compensation, unconsciously, for his breathlessness. If any of that is true, which I deeply doubt, there's a relation between Proust's syntax and the Paris Commune. Now notice that that's a relationship between literature and history, which is in terms of form, not in terms of content. The way history insinuates itself into literature, as so often, of course, is in form, not in content. In fact, Lukács once said that form was the major bearer of ideology in literature, and Fred Jameson remarked that Marxist critics have a particular responsibility, he said, to pay attention to the shape of the sentences. Alas, and here begins a piece of elderly grousing that you couldn't ignore and just turn on your phones if you care to do. Alas, it's not only Marxist critics, but hardly any critics take Jameson's statement seriously, responsibility to come to terms with the shape of the sentences, with tone and mood and texture and rhythm and so on. People reading, students of literature today, and here's the elderly grousing bit, can't say things like the poem's shambling syntax is curiously at odds with its ebullient tone. I wonder why that's funny. It is funny, isn't it? No, they can't say that. They can't say, as a critic of a T.S. Eliot poem once said, there's something very sad about the punctuation. That's literary criticism. Speaking of punctuation, which I often do, at great length, particularly about the sad death of the colon. The colon is dying on its. Death through the colon is still, I'm afraid, quite. But the death of the colon. Anyway, I don't get me onto that. But if you look at the use of the comma in Lawrence's prose, if anybody dares read Lawrence today, a sporadic genius. If you look at the comma, you see that it's part of an attempt to write fluidly. Lawrence hardly ever writes a short sentence, and all that in turn is related to his metaphysics of so-called spontaneous creative life, and that in turn to sexuality in Lawrence. So, you can draw a link, if you have the time to do so, between the comma in Lawrence and a great deal more. But thinking of the way that history enters form, an obvious example surely is the so-called heroic couplet, where the symmetry and antithesis and equipoise and closure of the lines are all about a certain conception of order, a certain, so the slightest ruffling of that, the slightest, syntactical inversion or grammatical inversion is going to register very much. There's something about that form that speaks of order in a wider sense, and that is also true, I think, of what you might call romantic aesthetics, romantic and idealist aesthetics, always remembering that aesthetics is usually politics by other means. It's also theology, actually, by the means. Aesthetics stands in. The work of art stands in for God, basically. But the romantic and idealist aesthetics is concerned with the way in which form and content continually meld into each other, in a way in which a certain kind of energy, while threatening at every moment to overspill in its turbulence and dynamism, is just about contained, just about held back in some reticent way by the power of form, but not in a coercive way, not a form which is imposed coercively or mechanically upon that content, but somehow is interwoven with it. And all that is a political allegory. All that is, among other things, about how you're to preserve certain kinds of energies, not least with an emerging bourgeoisie in Europe, without violating traditional kinds of form. And this is particularly crucial in the wake of the French Revolution. Aesthetics is an important aspect of Romanticism in general, are an important response to that. How form and content become a kind of allegory or exemplary of a certain kind of political state. Now, I'm just leaping from one random example of this to another at the moment. Just to go back for a moment to the heroic couplet, you get the sense in that of fending off a certain kind of chaos, you know? And what happens with modernism is that chaos begins to invade the form itself. You don't get modernism, properly so called, until fragmentation and alienation and self-estrangement and so on now are actually infiltrating and undermining from within the very forms of art. Realism, of course, is the great success story of the middle classes. I mean, one of the most tenacious and enduring and deep-rooted and indeed popular of literary forms, which essentially is based upon an idea that there is a narrative implicit in reality itself. There is a kind of story immanent in the world. The world itself is story-shaped. And the job of the literary text is to dig this out, is to represent in a concrete and concretizing and sensuous way this narrative, which is there in some sense anyway. Around about 1900, possibly on the 3rd of March, but I'm not absolutely sure about that, all of that begins to disintegrate. You can't any longer tell a story properly. Yes, you can't tell a story without shifting perspectives or casting doubt on a certain subjective perspective or writing recursively, returning obsessionally, using repetition and multi-layered narrative and the rest. There's when that happens in art, then something crucial has happened to history itself. And indeed, the modernist period, let's say roughly 1880, 1930, or whatever, about which I've written a brilliant and indispensable book, which you have to read if you are to call yourself educated at all. That period is the period of the crack up of narrative. You're just not able really to tell a story anymore. And the bringing into doubt of the objectivity of truth, which postmodernism, of course, will elaborate in many ways. There isn't, if you think of, let's say, from Henry Fielding or Defoe onwards, just take English literature, let alone Europe, there is hardly a single tragic novel until Thomas Hardy, until that period, until the end, the downturn of the fortunes of the European bourgeoisie, the economic depression, impending world war, the growth of revolutionary forces, the emergence of the labor movement, this serious disruption for Hardy, certainly in the countryside, in relationships in the countryside. Before that, astonishingly, there is almost no novel in English which you could call tragic, with the possible exception, arguable exception of Wuthering Heights, which is exceptional, of course, in all kinds of strange, which is very weird in all kinds of ways. The phrase tragic novel is an oxymoron, like, say, business ethics. Also an oxymoron. Used to be military intelligence, but I'm updating. I'm trying to think of a more fashionable thing. Because of course the novel reflects the enormous self-assurance, overweening self-assurance of the middle classes at their height, all of which is going to go haywire, very shortly. But another reason for that refusal of tragedy is of course that that literature, art, is meant to edify. There's a deep Victorian ideology that the point of art is to raise our spirits, is to be therapeutic in the midst of so much class conflict and so on, because disillusion can quickly lead to political disaffection. And bourgeois is quite aware of that in the Victorian period. So that even if, so that form has to fight very hard against historical fact in order to massage it and manipulate it in ways that will be edifying and enhancing, rather than depressing and potentially disaffecting. So that, we know that in real life, Tom Jones, I'm not talking about the Welsh singer, by the way. Tom Jones would have been hanged. I mean, the Welsh singer should have been hanged many years ago. Tom Jones should have been hanged. But of course, you have to bring the fiction round to a harmonious and uplifting and conclusion where the villains get their comeuppance and the virtuous get their rewards and so on. Oliver Twist in real life, I mean, how come that he was brought up in a workhouse and speaks perfect standard English? Because he's virtuous, and virtuous people speak standard English in the Victorian period. When he meets the Dodger first time he meets the Dodger in London, the Dodger says something like, what's the row then, mate? And Oliver says, I'm very tired and hungry. So, you have to massage the facts in that way. But you can also do that, of course, ironically. You can show how the factitiousness of your conclusion. This isn't the way it would have worked out in real life. Indeed, alarmingly, it could be that literature or fiction is now the only place there is in society where the vicious do get their comeuppance and the virtuous get their reward. Maybe there's nowhere else. There's a quite alarmingly dark side to that. I'll finish by, I have a pathological fear of overrunning my time, which is I'm the only speaker in the world who has that. So I'll finish in a few minutes. A remark about the second part of our concerns, which is politically committed literature or art. I come from the city of Salford. Somebody has to. My mother remembered F.S. Lowry sketching by the roadside. He was given quite a wide berth by the local people, partly because he was an artist, but mainly because he was a rent collector. That was Lowry's actual job. And in the 1930s, there was an agitprop group in Salford. At a time when agitprop was rapidly proliferating throughout Europe, agitation and propaganda, agitprop began in the early Soviet Union, mainly to traveling theatre, which dramatized what was happening in the revolutionary events in the cities, dramatized for the peasantry. Anyway, it spread as far as Salford, and there was a young guy as part of the group called Red Megaphones in Salford, called Ewan McColl, who was born and bred in Salford, who wrote a famous song, Dirty Old Town, not to the liking of every occupant of Salford, that the name of their town should become synonymous with with squalor. I had a very strange dream the other night, actually. I hope this won't go any further. There are no members of the special branch here, or I'm sure they're not. That I was singing Dirty Old Town shoulder to shoulder with Nigel Farage. What on earth does that mean? Maybe somebody could discuss this later. Anyway, McColl, of course, a very famous and great folk singer. His partner was a woman called Joan Littlewood, I'm sure you know of, who brought politically committed theatre to the East End in Theatre Workshop. And Littlewood took under her wing a young Salford woman who was the daughter of a bus driver called Sheila Delaney, who of course you also know of, who wrote a stunning play called A Taste of Honey, which was part of the early wave of working class film and drama at the time. And Sheila Delaney, with whom I was once in a convalescent home when we were children, Sheila Delaney had an on-off relationship with the son of the local Salford bookmaker, called Albert Finney, and who, of course, again, was in at the very beginning of the wave of working class drama and art. And when a very young Salfordian filmmaker called Mike Leigh wanted some money to make his films, Albert gave him the money, gave Mike Leigh the money. And when I had a play on in London about 30 years ago, Mike Leigh didn't give me any money, but he gave me some quite invaluable advice. So you see, it all ends with me, really. You know, it's all this whole tradition going back to agitprop, the Soviet Union. You know, all culminates on my humble self. Although there are one or two sidetracks here in Salford, not far from the very grimy and smelly little primary school I attended. There was a street called Holly Street, in which there was a young child called Peter Maxwell Davis, who of course ended up as master of the Queen's music, and then went off to live in the Orkneys. And there was also, not far from that, a place where a young Salford lab technician used to read Rimbaud and Baudelaire and so on in the Salford Public Library, and became the most, I suppose, popular punk poet of the country, John Cooper Clarke. He was, of course, still is, so thin that you could hardly see him if you looked at him sideways. You know, if he was sideways. But there was a time when he actually managed to kick the hard drugs and put on a tiny, almost invisible bit of weight. And he was walking down the street. He was telling me this. He was walking down the street in Salford when somebody shouted to him, "Hey, Clarke, get back on the drug, you fat fuck." And since all my talks have to end on the word fuck and start with the phrase Marcel Proust's mother, I better end it there. Thank you.
So I was very excited when I was invited to this panel, but then the closer I came to the date, the more nervous I became, because even though I think of myself as a politically committed person, and I think of some of what I write as literature, I've actually never thought about what is politically committed literature. And then it occurred to me that I was sitting in a panel with people who would spend their whole life writing about literature and political commitment and Marxism. So I had this kind of imposter syndrome, and I decided that the only productive thing that I could do was to try and reflect inductively from my work on the relationship between literature and political commitment. Starting with the book that Esther mentioned, Free, which was a coming-of-age story. It was a story of growing up in communist Albania and the transition to communism, from communism to capitalism, then maybe eventually to communism later. But it was a book that was translated in many languages and won many prizes. And when I was invited by the current Albanian Prime Minister, Edi Rama, who wanted to congratulate me on the success of this book, he said, "Yeah, congratulations, but you know, you shouldn't be very proud of it because you didn't really write the book." And I said, "What do you mean I didn't write the book? Who wrote the book if it wasn't me?" He said, "Well, it was Enver Hoxha." And this reminded me of the, I hope people know who Enver Hoxha is. I don't need to introduce, okay. So this reminded me of the time in which Pablo Picasso was in Paris drawing a mural for a competition that he was about to enter. And at some point, Guernica happened, the attack on Guernica, and he changed the mural completely and started writing the famous mural that we now know as Guernica. And in the various visits from Nazi officers to his study, who would go there with the pretense of taking an interest in his art, but really trying to surveil him, they were looking at the mural as it was being made. And so they said to him, "Oh, Picasso, did you make this?" And Picasso, as you probably know, the anecdote, turned to them and said, "No, you made it." So I think, actually, this anecdote resonates with the way in which I always thought about literature and the relationship between art and political commitment. Politically committed literature and art, as I see it, is a kind of activity that tries to refine the lens through which we observe reality, and to understand and to interpret the concerns and the commitments of one's contemporaries, and to analyze events with an eye to both social critique and to possible alternatives, but also to obstacles to possible alternatives. And a writer is someone who, I think, just does their role in the division of labor in society. The writer has a certain kind of toolkit, just as worker has another toolkit, and lawyer has yet another toolkit, and so on. And going back to Picasso, at one point Picasso was asked to elaborate on this account and on his approach, which, as I say, was roughly similar to the one that I have just described on the relationship between art and politics. And he reportedly says to, this is an interview in 1945 that he gives to a magazine, where he says, "What do you think is an artist?" Quote, "A fool who has only eyes if he's a painter, only ears if he's a musician, only a liar for all the chords of the heart if he's a poet, or even if he's a boxer, only muscles." Now, I don't know why he thought of boxers as artists, but the rest of the sentence leads to his conclusion, which is, again, quote, "Painting is not made to decorate houses. It's a weapon of offensive and defensive war against the enemy." So this leads to the second part of my intervention, which is, who is the enemy? And the connection between politically committed literature and the Marxist tradition. So who is the enemy? If you're a Marxist, the enemy is capitalism, or at least one of the enemies is capitalism. If you're an Albanian Marxist like me, it's both capitalism and a certain kind of Marxism itself. And it raises the question, when it comes to political commitment, that kind of Marxism raises the question of the relationship between politically committed literature on the one hand and propaganda on the other. So when does politically committed literature not become propaganda? And I think, as I was trying to sort of theorize and think about this, again, inductively, from both my work and my experiences, the distinction, I think, lies in the relationship to power. So committed literature is a kind of literature that resists power in all its forms, including in the form that power reveals by those who claim to speak in the name of emancipation and liberation. And I think this question of the relationship between literature, politically committed literature, and propaganda is actually a particularly delicate one when one thinks about the legacy of something like socialist realist tradition. Again, in my part of the world, when you talk about politically committed literature, people mostly think about the years in which painters were told by the League of Artists, actually, the sun is not in the right place in this painting, it's not showing the worker happy enough. Or if you're a writer, someone would say this character actually is too reminiscent of Dostoevsky nihilism, and we don't have enough harmony here, and we don't have an accurate description of social reality. So it seems to me that an effort to think about, from a Marxist perspective, this question of literature and political commitment needs to somehow confront this double legacy of Marxism, both in the West and also in Eastern Europe, so in the communist world, former communist world. And I think, in a way, this reflects the different approaches that people have to the Marxist tradition in those two parts of the world. So on the one hand, I think in Eastern Europe, when you talk to most people about Marxism, they think of it as life, as a life experiment and a body of experiences that are mainly historical experience, and that often are used to discredit the ideas. So the philosophy of Marxism is one thing, the history and the politics of it is another thing, and often many people would use that experience to tell you that actually the ideas are irrelevant and that the philosophy is somehow been discredited by the real world. On the other hand, if you think about the legacy of Marxism in the Western world, so the world that hasn't experienced any real world socialism, the attitude is one that only cares about the ideas, and the history and the politics often is the history and the politics of failed experiments where people did something wrong, but something wrong that wasn't really related to the ideas themselves or to the theoretical elaborations. And so on the one hand, you have this kind of Western Marxism, where Marxism is mainly philosophy. And on the other hand, you have the former communist world in which Marxism is mainly life. And as I've been thinking about, what does it mean to be a politically committed writer who thinks about Marxism as both? How does this show in the work? And how does this, and this goes back to some of the things that Terry was saying about in the forum. And in my case, this took the form of exploring ideas, both as philosophical ideas, but also as ideas that are actually the ideas in the name of which people live lives and have tried to make sense of the world. And so this effort for me has then turned into a kind of effort to experiment with genre, and in particular to find a middle way between literature on the one hand and philosophy on the other. So maybe I just say a few words on what this means, in my case, to think about both literature and philosophy. And until I started writing in a more literary vein, I had just a philosopher's hat on. And when I was writing philosophy, the idea was that you start with certain convictions, start with a theory, say Marxism or socialism, and you try to prove to your adversaries that the objections are mistaken. And so you have something that follows a reasoning process. You start with certain premises, you try to validate the premises, you then fight the objections, then you get to the conclusions. And of course, if you're trying to write literature, this is a recipe for either propaganda literature or for terrible literature, in which characters become just the puppets of some philosopher who is trying to move them in such a way that they reflect ideas. And they're actually not like real people anymore, because real people are much more complicated and they aren't just the vehicles of ideas. So while philosophy starts with, as I say, ideas and tries to come to certainty, literature challenges that certainty, and so starts with characters and with plot and with detail and with psychological dilemmas, and kind of observes these dilemmas in real life. And this means a kind of, for me, the effort to do both means a blurred form of writing in which the books are driven by philosophical ideas. So one of my books is about freedom, the other one is freedom, the other one is about dignity, the next one is going to be about equality. So the concept sort of helps you shape the book and write in a way that these ideas are present constantly in the discussions, in the conversations. You see how the characters challenge the ideas, how they argue over them, and so on. But on the other hand, the ideas are also have to be in the literary form somehow abandoned, and you just have to see what they mean in the lives of people and in these kind of traumatic historical circumstances. And there, literature acquires, I think, a kind of democratic function that philosophy doesn't have, because it enables you to create more doubt. So you start with the certainties of ideas, and you then see how the ideas shape real lives, and you see how they are present in different characters, and how the characters fight with each other over the ideas, or how they live the implications of the ideas. So then literature becomes something much more complicated, in which you see in the work the tensions that we then see also in the world. So it becomes this kind of mirror to social reality. So on the one hand, as I say, philosophy asks you to constantly argue your standpoint and to defend it and to show the limitation of alternatives. On the other, literature asks you to kind of embrace the alternatives for the sake of challenging the certainty of the ideas and embrace the doubt that philosophy tries to resolve. So the other point that I want to make in relation to this sort of hybrid writing, where I'm trying to engage with this body of ideas as both philosophy and lived experience, is the relationship between history and how we think about historicity and facts. And I think another thing that literature, or maybe politically committed literature, tries to do is to reconstruct the different ways of thinking about history. So one standard way to think about history is to think of it as facts, and the reconstruction of facts, and the search for facts, and the ordering of facts. And so the sense that we access the truth by thinking about facts. But of course, any historian will tell you, facts only lead to the truth if you can trust the mechanism through which facts are transmitted. And again, any historian who has entered an archive or has engaged with historical evidence knows that archives, evidence, are always shaped by some authority that orders the evidence in such a way that it selects certain things as relevant and excludes others. So it makes, at all points, there are heuristic decisions that get made on what to include and what to exclude. And often what's really interesting is what are excluded by the ordering of the facts in a certain way rather than what the facts themselves are telling you. So in the case of my last book, which was about my grandmother's life and trying to reconstruct her life based on communist surveillance archives, what became very clear very quickly was that you couldn't really trust these surveillance archives. So you went there trying to find the truth of a life, but then what you realize is there are layers and layers of propaganda and ways in which those who report her life are actually constructing it based on their own interests or on their own imperatives or on the things that they haven't, that they need to assert somehow. So you then become much more, you just realize that there is the facts of history don't give us an answer when it comes to the question of how can we challenge the interpretation of facts that historical sources give us? How can we challenge the authority of the archive, or how can we challenge the authority of the whichever body has systematized the facts in a certain way? And so then I think what literature does is an alternative approach to history, which isn't factual history, but is something like what German Enlightenment philosophers used to call conjectural history. And conjectural history is history read from a moral standpoint, from a moral perspective, from a perspective that looks at the way in which facts have been ordered and asks itself the question of how has power shaped those facts? And so how can I engage critically with them? How can I resist the way in which power orders the facts? And how can I tell an alternative story that isn't included in the archive, that isn't part of the story that is being told? And in this effort of literature to recover what these German philosophers called conjectural history, or these Enlightenment philosophers called conjectural history, someone like Schiller, for example, thought that that's where the power of art to give us some kind of higher access to a moral truth lies vis-a-vis either politics or history. And what he meant by that was not that the politics was irrelevant, but that when you face yourself with ideology and with propaganda and with manipulation of the facts, the only way that you might have to actually recover some authenticity and a more moral perspective in relationship to the facts is to actually use the writer's imagination. So to go to a perspective on the facts that is not just ordering them, but asking itself the question of how do these facts shape lives, and how do they show up in moral motives, and what are they excluded, and how does the morality of an authority, for example, relate to the morality of human beings more generally. And so in this constant dialogue and interplay, you generate the critical input that is required to read history in a certain way. And when history is read in that way, the point of it is that the reflection on the past then isn't really in reconstructing the truth about the past, but it's rather in somehow unveiling the lies of our time. Because this critical perspective, this approach to the past that asks itself the question of how have these facts been constantly manipulated and shaped for us, the point of that exercise is to actually reflect on your own time and the way in which the facts by which we are surrounded, or the way in which they are interpreted, are no longer taken for granted. And so literature then plays this function of, as I say, challenging history and challenging a certain reading of the facts that teases out a more critical interpretation of social reality. So literature basically embodies a search for agency through which you try to appropriate a world that you don't make from scratch, but that you discover with all its flaws, and literature helps you see where those flaws are, and to which you respond by understanding it, by challenging it, by trying to change what you do. And so in literature understood as this conjectural approach to history, what you discover is then characters, particular characters, but that aren't, according to Schiller, just particular characters, but that they are models of humanity as a whole. So these characters are actually there as reflections of a moral ideal, and that's why he thought that the aesthetic is a symbol for the ethic. And so what you do, you have in literature this kind of cross-spatial, cross-temporal collective effort through which both the writer and the reader engage critically with the world in which they find themselves. And in constructing this conversation between the writer and the reader, and in this kind of critical engagement with the world in which they find themselves, what they're also doing is prefiguring an alternative world in which there is more social freedom. And I think that's more or less what the meaning of politically committed literature beyond propaganda means. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for being here. It's late on a Thursday, I think it is. So I have, it's like 4 pages, so be patient. And it's divided into parts. And the first part of what I have to say is called political commitment in the context of called the paper overall writing and counter-hegemony. So like with art, thinking about literature is about thinking the construction of hegemony. This is true today as it was in the previous century, the 20th century. I've lived part of it, when communism was still believed to be a beginning of history. And as opposed to that, a whole historical generation, I don't mean by age, but I mean kind of like sharing a context, a whole historical generation of writers came into being when capitalism was presented as the end of history, which you probably know. Of course, it was called democracy rather than capitalism, but most of us knew it was capitalism that took over. And as it happened, of the kind that would turn democracy more and more into a bitter joke. Whatever, as Michel Houellebecq's English translator called his first novel, the actual French title of which read Extension of the Field of Struggle. So he translated as whatever was our case. Initially, I found the contrast of the two titles quite funny. And that's because this was the 90s. A lot of things seemed funny in Europe then. Yugoslavia was torn into pieces. A lot of things seemed funny in a mean way. The way to relate to, or for some of us, to relate through cultural products was subtle cynicism. This could be expressed in different ways. For example, an author could use her novel to check out the territory, the readership, who could understand her or not, those able to figure out the origins of a phrase she gives them, or who feel delight at the recognition of a hint that points perhaps to Althusser, or to Men Without Hats, the band, and so on. So these very few people would be the ones that this novelist would be really communicating with. The others would have merely read a novel. Communication, sharing seemed somehow compromised, and something from which a writer should be protected from. A Marxist writer even more. So a cynical view of the readers, a starting point of distrust towards them, seemed logical. And even if it did not seem logical, it expressed what has been called the spirit of the times and was thus unavoidable. Why started this discussion of Marxism, literature, and political commitment with a reference to cynicism? Because cynicism is the word that kind of really jumps out in Theodor Adorno's essay titled Commitment. The essay was written when the post-1989 writers and their subtle cynicism did not yet exist. But Adorno still finds cynicism. He says, and I quote, "The question asked by a character in Sartre's play, Mort sans sépulture, is there any meaning in life when men exist who beat people until the bones break in their bodies, is also the question whether any art now has a right to exist, whether intellectual regression is not inherent in the concept of committed literature because of the regression of society." End of quote. And then he says that the right response is that the fact that literature exists after Auschwitz is not a surrender to cynicism, his words. I'm not sure Adorno was right to generalize, because as we see, cynicism can reside in history, the spirit of the times, rather than an attitude that an author assumes consciously. Should we be concerned about cynicism today? It really depends on how one looks at literature. If one is willing to continue thinking about political aesthetics as forming at the point of encounter with a singular artwork, cynicism recedes sometimes. I can give an example. During the live-stream genocide of the Palestinian people, my friends in Greece discovered Hassan Kanafani. I started hearing about the feeling of suffocation, the anxiety, the rage that the short stories of Kanafani induced in them. The stories rank for me amongst the masterpieces of post-war fiction, if that's the word, were from the 50s. But so why were they not discussed before the genocide? I fully understand the urge to educate ourselves, but I have no solution over how to extricate such education from the market that sustains the gate on the pain of others, as Susan Sontag put it in 2004, and as Adorno himself, many decades back, described it rather cynically in his commitment essay, discussing works that he says obtain pleasure from presenting suffering. Kanafani did not just write fiction that can cut through our lethargic political consciousness. He also wrote books titled The Revolution of 1936 to 1939 in Palestine and on Zionist literature. In a review of the English translations that we recently published in Third Text, Jay Murphy notes, and I quote, "Written in a time of apparent defeat, Kanafani entered that strong Marxist tradition of deepened reflection, of personal and political reorganization following a period of frustration or debacle that produced so many of that tradition's classics, Lenin's The Development of Capitalism in Russia, Antonio Gramsci's The Prison Notebooks, or Marx's Capital itself. What Kanafani produced was a quintessential example of what Lenin had called the concrete analysis of a concrete situation, what he judged as the living soul of Marxism. Kanafani had been instrumental in the development of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and its adoption of revolutionary Marxism as a strategy." End of quote. Kanafani's experimental and militant realism in his fiction written as letters to lost in more ways than one, friends, Letters to Lost Friends, led to a famous festival reading by John Berger many years back, during which this, one of my favorite British Marxist critic and novelist, ended up in tears reading Kanafani's short story. Kanafani had been assassinated decades ago. This is an encounter with no trace of cynicism. It is indeed one that prompts us to question the established link between aesthetics and pleasure. Really, why is it assumed by Adorno and many others that we derive or should derive primary or any kind of pleasure from literature or the work of art? We can ask this question, but a different problem remains in the encounter between these two Marxists. No literary reading will undo the colonial cycle of violence that the British Empire opened in Palestine over a century ago. In literature, as an international field of art, what is the position of a British Marxist novelist in relation to a Palestinian Marxist novelist? Historically, what is it? What are these Marxists divided on, and how are they connected? Is there Marxism, their field of commonality that can prevail against the concrete situation of the imperialist divide? It is mainly this question that I would like the Marxist literary theory to grapple with when thinking about political commitment. This question will never be answered by picking apart the literary work per se. It is structural, but it is not ideological. Instead, we first have to look at the contradictions of the infrastructure that we call the capitalist international market for literature. An example, in July 2024, Publisher for Palestine published a long article about the Frankfurt Book Fair's complicity to the genocide. One section was titled, "German Publishing Multinationals' Massive Investment in Israeli Tech, meaning AI, Security, Surveillance, and more, things that kill." I'm surprised all this could even be traced, that is the function and the circles of multinationals. The reader in this text encounters a monopoly maze, not confined to Germany, of course, but predictably encompassing the Anglophone literary world. Bertelsmann, I quote, owns the Frankfurt Fair, and actually bragged about it, And it is cited as one of the largest media conglomerates in the world, with a reported record profit in 2022 of 32.8 billion euros. And it owns Penguin Random House, which publishes some of my favorite essays by John Berger. This company also owns umbrella corporations that include the international media conglomerate RTL Group, music label and publisher BMG, IT and Finance Corp, Arvato, and a number of Bertelsmann subcore in education, printing, and broadcasting. So we're talking about like an endless empire. And so on. How can political commitment be articulated here, especially as what we're talking about is the essence of what capital does when it is capital? It is the market as infrastructure that must be the first plane of intervention of Marxist political commitment then. And this perhaps would end the distinction between autonomous and committed literature that Adorno discussed. Because this distinction is not the problem. I now want to turn briefly to the question of genre. What is a genre? Because we were sent such a prompt question, actually, for this panel. And here I'm going to take two books, one by filmmaker and memoir author Chantal Akerman. Perhaps some of you know her. The book is titled My Mother Laughs. It's from 2013. It was written in France. And the other one by Claudia Pinheiro. It's called Elena Knows, and it was published in 2007 in Spanish. And Pinheiro is the author of crime novels, which I really don't like. I don't like crime novels. Pinheiro's, the funny thing is Akerman's was translated for various reasons long before, the Spanish book. But what I want to point out is that Akerman's memoir, because that's what it is, and Pinheiro's crime novel have the same subject: a daughter as carer for her mother, as the mother is crippled by illness and slowly dying. They're not the first books, by the way, on this, or essays. Neither book is politically committed in a Marxist way, but the Marxist feminist reader, that's me. So for this reader, the subject matter of mother-daughter relationship and care labor is the foremost political subject, one to which I have a long list of, as I studied, of such works. Perhaps I should add that besides experiential writing, there is also something called experiential reading, or at least for me, it exists. Because I speak from this position as a reader who has lived through what the two books narrate in their very different ways. And there is a further piece of useful knowledge here. Only one of the two authors is still alive, the one who wrote the novel and not the memoir. The one who wrote her mother's illness while she cared for her committed suicide after completing the book, delivering the truth, and indeed became something like the heroine of the crime novel. But I'm not going to do a spoiler here and tell you how this works. So I'm omitting a lot, but I cannot bypass the fact of the dead and alive female authors of these two genres, especially in relation to subject matter and form. Both works are overwhelming and engage in shattering realism, by which I mean that they negotiate a relationship to an inescapable reality. By writing a fiction work allowed a certain distance and a play of impersonation, whereas writing a non-fiction work about the very relationship of these two bodies left no such distance. It is a platitude, of course, to say that the two books achieve different things. So I won't say it, because the thing is that they don't achieve different things. The two books achieve exactly the same structural feeling and immersion into the reality of illness, care, labor, mother-daughter love, and misgivings. They really flatten you emotionally, not reducing, but magnifying your pain, making it huge. So the two different genres concern here the two authors rather than the reader. The reader is suffering anyway. And the kind of self-exposure that each author is able to mobilize and share, and to what end. In this regard, writers are less perhaps choosing their genre and are more chosen by their genre. The genre that, so that they can seek relief and a degree of knowledge that involves limits and boundaries in circumstances not of their choosing. Now, to move on to the question of class, social class, money. And because this was another question that came for the panel. And I hope I can move into this question about class easily, since I have just mentioned care label. The question of class is a rather thorny issue for Marxism and literature. The issue of political commitment relates to this. How are readers approached as class subjects? What kind of literature suits the capitalist class, and what literature should one write for the working class so that it questions its position? Today, the contraction of Marxism has been such that Marxism often delights in the mere representation of class relations in a novel, which we have, from the 19th century, to say the least. Great, so someone remembered to do it, or even dare to do it. Of course, the question here should be, is it really possible to remove literature from the class relation? Where to start? I will start with this. Before class becomes a subject matter, or form even in literature, it is a position in the mode of production that articulates a division of labor. Class is outside the text, and it is what allows or not the text to exist. There exist classes from which it is easiest to write and classes that prevent you from writing. Imagine a novel with the following plot. It's the late 50s. A poor woman peasant from Southern Europe had a daughter who was writing her little fiction stories as a schoolgirl. The girl wrote in the basement of their peasant home, and one day her mother, who was illiterate, as most peasant women were, cleared out the space, the basement, because it needed storage, and she burned everything that was in it, and of course, the daughter's writing and literature. The little girl never wrote again. Having absorbed her class position, she used her good grades at school to get a white-collar job after her graduation and support her mother and eventually also her own new family. It is not an exceptional story. This non-becoming, right, in an environment that tells us it's all about becoming in the future. Rather, it keeps played out again and again. This non-realization is persistently registered as personal failure. You did not want it enough. You gave up. Anyone forced to write after a working day of 10 hours or more will know what I mean. Writing from within the working class means writing on the backs of all those who never managed to overcome the prohibition to write against the imperative of the wage relation. And this is why so many resign to the position of the reader. This is why we have so many more readers rather than writers. The problem, the condition I'm describing, does not just arise in literature. Every time I hear of a young leftist filmmaker or artist who makes highly praised work about class, but does not have to worry about making a living because he or she or they get a modest monthly income from an apartment they have inherited from their parents, the problem becomes reanimated. But the problem of class finds many expressions. The colonial state of being and cultural imperialism is one such expression. Coloniality and imperialism are class relations transferred into the field of intercultural relations, where we also find literature. The formation of a literary canon is an ongoing problem premised on class nations and their weak or strong infrastructures that meet within an unled internationalism and where one sells according to entrenched stereotypes. As far as I can see, literary criticism has done far less to address class as an imperialist relation and an infrastructural one in comparison to our criticism, visual art criticism, that has addressed the manufacture of artist visibility and invisibility in the international field. And so, writing as a Marxist compelled me to produce a written intervention just recently in Greece when critics, theorists, and fellow novelists started discussing the loss of interest in Greek literature after that the previous decade, the 2010s, when the country had enjoyed its 15 minutes of fame precisely as a class nation because of its indebted situation, its dire finances. So the 2010s had seen the translation of novels and poetry that addressed the Greek crisis. The moment passed, and the ensuing loss of attention prompted a writer to suggest that the crisis, in these words, had not been exploited properly where literature was concerned. That the misery of the Greek working classes should have been exploited to boost international sales was eye-opening for me. It affirmed the choice I made many years back, as it was not argued cynically, but in good faith. The lesson, which we knew already from the visual art scene, was that class misery could be a valuable sales point and that everyone should sell what they own as their heritage. And my final little part, writing against or with history. And what does this mean? For anyone writing as a Marxist, such limits and determinations can only be sidelined at the political cost of reproducing the structures of domination as the concrete situation that is evaded for the literary act to continue as aesthetics more than politics. You know this book, right? Aesthetics and Politics, very famous verse book. For this act to continue, content and form must continue being seen as exhausted within the singular work of literature, as if any such work realizes textually the freedom that is removed from social life. I can hardly think of anything more affirmative of the bourgeois illusion than this position, which will continue providing us with marginalized subjects, situated experiences, there will be no shortage, and imagined flights from modernity. But modernity cannot be exited any more than history can. It can certainly not be exited by anyone who publishes. What a writer can do with history is pretend that it is concluded. Revisionist literary criticism in Greece has been trying to ensure a general amnesia about the communist writers, the Greek communist writers of the 20th century, the ones imprisoned, brutally tortured, and writing in the open-air prisons of the islands that many of us now holiday, or as exiles in the socialist East, which are the only countries that would take them. Writing as a Marxist after 1989 meant also that you put aside this history as concluded, if for different reasons than the enemy, that was the revisionists, the conservatives. Coming back to the beginning of my short talk, I would say that the cynicism of engaged 1990s literature had to do with this abandonment of the thread, of this compulsive abandonment of communist literature of the 20th century. Partly, this had to do with the consciousness of a new concrete situation that was presumably forming, the ominous global subject, I would call it. If there was no new concrete situation, why bother write at all? Personally, I try to make readers feel new by because that's what you need to do, I can tell you, by revealing that no hiding place was left for anyone, anywhere, and that the return of fascism could be narrativized as a manifesto of defeat, indeed. But nothing demanded the abandonment. And today, I feel that the dividing line was the past generation's hopefulness against the odds. The 20th century communist writers in Greece, they had this hopefulness And this hopefulness, which had to be suppressed for us to exist as Marxists in contemporary literature, this hopefulness was intolerable, disorienting, alien. Is it still so? Because many years have passed. In many ways, yes. But this is what I argue must change. A continuum must be claimed precisely as an instantiation of political commitment in the present tense, because the distance which we feel towards the communist literature of the past century is an outcome of the same hegemony that destroys the land and the city as sites of struggle, that makes us forget what has been there. Crafting a connecting thread, owning the perishing, refuting the segregation of generations cannot but be, in my view at least, a central part of Marxism's encounter with literature as counter-hegemony. One reenacted in restless, searching, unforgiving writing, as many times as necessary. Thank you.